Hello, everybody. I think we will get started. Thank you all for joining us, and I think it's pretty much a good afternoon wherever you are. So again, thank you for joining the Longevity Book Club. And today we are very, very privileged to have Professor Andrew Scott join us today, talking about his book called The Longevity Imperative. I always give a shout out to the book and all of my notes. And actually, I also want to welcome my wandering colleague Ken Stern back to the fold. He missed our last book club, and even now he's joining us from Spain as he's researching his own book that we will be talking about a year from now.
That's for me. It's not good afternoon. It's actually good evening, but it's great to be here. Almost good night.
So I'm going to do a brief introduction for Andrew, but this is another funny one because Andrew is a good friend and colleague of the Center on Longevity. So trying to come up with something new and novel was tricky. But anyhow, thank you, Andrew. As I said, Andrew Scott is currently a professor of economics at the London Business School, and he is known as an expert in longevity and macroeconomics. Previously, he was a lecturer at Oxford and a visiting professor at Harvard and a researcher at the London School of Economics. Andrew's career trajectory is a great example of what happens when we have the opportunity to live these long lives. I was watching something the other day where one of Andrew's LBS colleagues introduced him by saying that for the first half of his academic career, he was a wonky macroeconomist who was studying business cycles, monetary fiscal policy, and debt management. But we will talk about how he made this pivot. He and Linda Grattan wrote a book called The 100-Year Life, and his academic and policy and advisory work shifted. And he's sort of now focused on longevity and aging, where frankly, his engagement and his expertise and his voice has started to shift the conversation about longevity. And we will get into more of that about that shift as we head through this. But Andrew, again, thank you for joining us. When I read the book, I was sort of struck at the very beginning by your personal narrative. And I knew a little bit about it, but I'm wondering if you'd share with the rest of us kind of that prologue and how that fed into writing the Longevity Imperative.
Yeah, so, one of the things I think is amazing about longevity is one of these, big aggregate trends that changes society, changes humanity. It's about, all sorts of fundamental issues, but then it's about really personal things. This is one of these big aggregate trends that's very personal. So I wanted to try and illustrate that with just reference to my family. And it was kind of remarkable because I sort of discovered my family is incredibly average. All the demographic trends you can see in my family. And the one that really struck me, I think, is one you're referring to, which I start the book at. I was an identical twin. And sadly, my twin died in the first few days. And I just as researched the book, just looked up the aggregate data, and I was really surprised. I was born in 1965. That was the most common age of death in the UK in 1965. And I kind of know I'm old. I didn't think I was born in Victorian England. So the idea that, that was the most common age of death. Today in the UK, it's 89. And that's the modal age, not the average age. But just dramatic change in how long we live has occurred. And, I quote the Samuel Beckett quote, we give birth astride a grave, the light flickers an instant and then it goes. Well, the instant's flickering a lot longer. And I think that's kind of the starting point of the book. Fundamental change in human existence, we can now expect to live a very long time, and that's never been the case before.
So, Andrew, Martha referenced the book that you did with Linda Grattan, The 100-Year Life, which I think for many people was a wake-up call. That book is now 7 years old, or give or take. What's changed in the interim? What has caused you to revisit the subject?
So great question. So one is this, I do sometimes wonder if the point of a long life is to write lots of books about longevity. I think this will be my last one. So the 100 Life is, and you can see in the chat how people like it. It's lovely. It sold over 1 million copies globally. There's a Japanese manga edition of the book. I've had the misfortune to see myself as a cartoon character in a manga and a manga book. So wonderful success. And, that originated, Martha was very interesting. What she said is sort of, my career shift, I was at a certain age. I was getting a bit bored of what I was doing. I was looking at new things, and I would always do this lecture at London Business School on an aging society, and you'll be very familiar with it. It's always a problem. You know, we term one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century the fact we're living for longer, and there's fewer children dying in infancy like my brother. There's fewer parents snatched away in midlife, more grandparents meeting their grandchildren. And economists call this an aging society. And I've never known anyone who says, yeah, aging society, great stuff. We turn it into a problem. It's just more old people. People get ill, they need a pension, they're a burden. You know, the sort of classic negative economic analysis. And halfway through that, there was a chart in that lecture that said, on average, we're living longer and we're healthier for longer. And I thought, well, that sounds quite good. How we turn this into just a bad news story? And that's how I got interested in the 100-year life as a topic. I thought it was about the length of life we had ahead of us. I spoke with Linda and we wrote this book, The 100-Year Life, which was a different perspective, a more forward-looking perspective, saying this is about time, not about end of life, and talking about what that meant for you about careers. And it clearly touched lots of people personally. For me, then I went on an intellectual journey. This is now where my academic research was being based. It was where I was going to start to have my policy impact rather than monetary and fiscal policy. And that then sent me on an intellectual journey, which was very broad, covering lots of different topics, which I like. And in terms of sort of, you know, aging and discovering who you are, I like multidisciplinary topics. But I also got frustrated because for all the success of the 100-Year Life, I wanted to get central banks, fiscal policy people, just to accept that this was something important. And, you know, AI and climate change, there's huge debate about how we adapt and adjust to them, how we ensure our future. But there's not the same around longevity. And to the extent we discuss it, it is this negative aging society story. And to be blunt, the adaptation and adjustment rarely gets beyond adult diapers and care homes, which surely we can do something better than that. So I wanted to make this a single trend up there with air and climate change. And it's kind of ridiculous, isn't it? Because if you think about our individual and collective future, there's few things as important as how we age, but it's just not a focus. So this book, I would say, goes a lot more about the economics. It's a lot more about different disciplines. It's a lot more about the health system. But it's also weaving together all the strands that we find fascinating about this topic and saying, this is up there with AI and climate change. This is about not just us as individuals, but changing the system.
So I do want to ask you about why it's not perceived as important as we do. But I wanted to say, so I was in Japan a month ago or so for research for my book, and I had a translator with me, and I think we spent all week together. And the thing that impressed him most about me during that week was the fact that I knew you, because he read your book and loved it, and you're a celebrity there. So
yeah, it's called Life Shift in Japan, which is actually a really good title. I mean, I love the 100-Year Life as a title, but Life Shift is also, I think, really interesting.
Well, it's made an impact there. I was in Singapore after Japan. When I was there, an article came out in the Straits Times, which is the paper of record, the national sort of the government organ, and it had an article on the 10 biggest challenges facing Singapore. And if any country in the world is aware of aging and what it means, it's Singapore. And it didn't make the list of the top 10 issues facing Singapore.
Wow.
And that struck me, and I'm sort of curious, why is it? Why do we not see this on the same level as climate change and lots of other things that, you know, very well may not affect us, may very well not certainly affect us in the way that aging is already changing lives.
I think so there's lots of levels to attack that issue. So one is around narrative, one is around psychology and concepts. Let me start with one of the aims of the book, which is, along with elevating longevity up there with AI and climate change, I do want to muscle to one side the aging society story. And by that, I mean this focus on a change in the age structure of the population. And it's not that that's unimportant. Of course, it's important. The fact that there's, you know, more people aged over 65 than under 5 is really, really important and creates all sorts of challenges. But I think it misleads us into thinking about older people. And we've become very messed up about the word aging. You know, going back to that claim, no one sort of hoops and hollers that we have an aging society, which it is a remarkable achievement. It's really quite phenomenal, but we sort of medicalized old age. So we see old age mainly in terms of decline. We underestimate the capacity of older people, which
Mhm.
of course is a very sort of big problem, both socially and individually. And I think we sort of slip when we use the word aging. I say we, I'm sort of collective we. You know, aging society quickly goes to be about end of life and quickly about frailty and death. And you know, that's a bit of a problem, isn't it? Because those are topics that very few people want to sort of focus on. And we think about it as inevitable. We think we can't change it. And really what I think is the most important thing that's happened is less that there's more old people than young people, but that for the first time ever, the young and middle age can expect to become old.
Mhm.
It's sort of it came about from some sort of little economic model I was playing with, but it's a really profound change, and it's hard to sort of, I think, grasp the sort of substantiveness of that. And I try over and over again in the book, but most of human history, only a minority of people became old. And so we just haven't invested in the institutions, in the health system to make sure we can support a life that isn't just long, which we are achieving, but that is healthy, engaged, and productive for long. And in the book, you know, I use the example of London weather, which, you know, everyone knows in London rains a lot. You know, if there's a 10% chance of rain in London, I don't pack an umbrella or a raincoat. If there's a 35% chance, I'll pack one of those small umbrellas and not a raincoat. And if there's an 80% chance of rain, it's a big overcoat and it's a big umbrella. What on earth am I talking about? Well, that's the probability of a 20-year-old in Sweden making it to 80 in 1851, 1951, and today. And that's kind of the essence of what I think is happening here. For the first time ever, we can expect to become old. And we kind of need the equivalent of the sort of Jera protector of a raincoat and umbrella. We've just got to prepare for this future. I call it the longevity imperative. You are now likely to become very old. We fear getting old. We fear outliving our health, our wealth, our skills, etc. So what do we do now to age well? And an aging society sort of begins when you've got lots of people aged over 65. I think a longevity society begins when you have lots of people who will live to be over 65. It's about preparing for that future so we can avoid the outcomes that we fear.
So you teach young people. Um, uh, do they think in that way, or do they want to avoid the topic of what that
So
future might look like?
yeah, I mean, I teach at a business school, so the students aren't the. I mean, it is a challenge, as you know, we all know. Whenever I'm giving talk about longevity or aging, I do expect the majority of the audience to be over 50 because it starts to become a very real issue there. I think it. You know, I'm very interested how we find different ways of engaging people. You mentioned in Japan, for instance, and I think what's interesting in Japan is the book is very appeals to a lot of people, not just old people, but also younger people, because it says we've got to be more flexible with how we structure our career path. We can't just have these conventional careers where you just work all the time and haven't got time for anything else. And I think that appeals a lot to younger people in Japan. I do think that you know my younger students they sort of get it, and I'll come back to that in a second in terms of getting it. But they're also particularly interested in health issues. I think that they get the point that they recognize that aging is a process. It's not an event that happens at 65. And that actually, if you do things when you're young, it improves what happens in the next decade. So again, I would say there's a sort of, amongst many of them, a very high consciousness about health and the connection with longevity. So they're particularly interested in that. But the other thing that I'm very keen on, I mean, I'm all of us, we're passionate about this topic personally, intellectually, at so many levels, and we want to do something about it. I also want to get people who aren't passionate about it engaged. I want them to say, oh, wow, I teach at a business school. I want them to say, wow, here's something that can be addressed and I can make a load of money from it. So I think I also want to get people engaged in that level, not just a personal level. And there, I think you can see an impact as well. One of the students said to me, I did this course because I want to think about a trend that's going to dominate my future as a business person. And, you know, I can do the standard accounting and strategy courses, but this seems to be something different. And I thought that was a great motivation for that particular course.
You could have been sitting in, we just had our weekly fellows seminar with our New Map of Life fellows. And there was a very interesting dialogue between one of our medical students who's coming up with a lifestyle medicine curriculum and Andrew's postdoc. Yannick Schindler, and they were actually sort of talking about the economics of preventive medicine.
Yeah.
And it was pretty dynamic, and they were very much focused on the fact that, you know, they're all in their 20s and they're like, we have to start now. So little changes.
Exactly. And that's, by the way, it's very interesting, that preventative work that's happening. It's very interesting.
Yeah. So Andrew, recently, as we continue to talk on similar subjects, we talk about increasing life expectancy. There's some pushback about, you know, we're not seeing life expectancy increase, particularly because of COVID.
Yep.
You know, what is the COVID impact?
Yeah. So when I first started getting involved in this area, I would talk to statisticians who said, we really don't like the concept of life expectancy. And I said, what do you mean? Yeah, and now, boy, do I understand what they're talking about. It's a very complicated concept, life expectancy. So let me think about where to begin. So first of all, let me say, I think whatever you think is happening to life expectancy trends, we already have an expectation of a long life. Global life expectancy is now over 70. In the US, the numbers are about 78, which I'll say in a minute is an underestimate. So these are long lives compared to what we've had before. So, you know, whatever happens going forward, we already have to adapt to long lives. Secondly, the headline life expectancy number, and I'm trying not to get too nerdy here. If I used to be a wonky macroeconomist, I can be a wonky longevity economist as well. It is really what's called the average age of death. That's really what it is. It says, let's look at mortality rates in a particular year. And let's imagine a child lives their life entirely in this particular year. And let's use those mortality rates to calculate their life expectancy. So, of course, when you have COVID and you have an increase in mortality rates at all ages, you see a big fall in life expectancy. So, you know, that's what we've seen with COVID. What tends to happen is, you know, assuming COVID then disappears, you go back to the previous mortality rates you had before. This is why when you have a war, or when they had the great influenza pandemic, you see this fall in life expectancy during the war and during the pandemic. But after those mortality risks have disappeared, it bounces back to its previous trend. So that's, I think, the impact of COVID. But we'll have to see. I mean, in my own country, there's an expectation you know, people may have some long-lasting health conditions, the health system is overburdened, and mortality rates might be higher for a while. Although interesting, this year mortality rates seem to be very low, actually. It's as if perhaps those who were most vulnerable died during COVID and the others are now physically stronger. So lots of stuff, but I don't really think COVID will change the long-term trends.
Okay.
Now, in the US, the long-term trends aren't great. You've had some small falls. It's been a little bit static. It's falling behind the increases in other countries, which, to be honest, I think is terrible.
Mm-hmm.
And China, which is GDP per head much less than America, now has higher life expectancy than America. So I rather than say it's not a problem, I would say, wow, you're now an 8-year gap with, say, Japan.
Yeah. And
that's a big gap. That's a big problem.
And certainly when you break it down by socioeconomic status, the differences are even more profound.
Well, that was the thing I was going to say. I mean, a little, and the UK is sort of going similar territory. You know, for instance, life expectancy at age 65 in America continues to rise, but life expectancy at birth has fallen for a few years. And that's because of the deaths of despair, that and the midlife crisis. And it's about rising income inequality. So if you're in a higher income bracket, your life expectancy continues to increase. Low income bracket, you've seen some falls because of those increases in midlife mortality. I in the book sort of stress that we should target healthy life expectancy as a key policy variable. And it's remarkable to me that we don't do that at the moment. I think if we did, we would be forced to take those inequality issues much more seriously.
Yeah. You know, I can't believe we're 20 minutes into this talk and we haven't even asked you what constitutes the longevity imperative.
Well, it's that sort of those three. Well, I mean, there's lots of things to it, but you're now likely to get old. We fear getting old. What are you going to do now? Because, and in sort of chapter 4 of the book or chapter 3 of the book, I try and use some health economic tools. But you know, the most important thing now is to age well. That didn't used to be important when you had a low chance of getting into your 80s and 90s. I've been doing some work with David Bloom at Harvard recently, and one of the most extraordinary statistics I've seen is that even in low-income countries, the biggest lifetime health burden of a newborn today will be aging-related diseases.
Mhm.
So, if we can now expect these long lives and global life expectancy over 70, literally the most important thing now is to age well. And of course, that's not just about the end of life, it's what you do throughout life. But that's why it's a longevity imperative. And, if I say the first longevity revolution has come to an end, no, it's coming to an end. The majority of the young can now expect to become old, which requires a second longevity revolution, which is to change how we age. Because, you know, I'm sure everyone listening in and in the chat knows that there's some wonderful things about longer lives, but there's some things to worry about. Just as with AI and climate change, there's lots of things we've got to make sure we seize the positives and avoid the negatives. But it's a real imperative because we've never had that need to do it before, but now we have to, because we have to deliver a three-dimensional longevity dividend. Make these lives healthier for longer and engaged for longer. And then that's a great thing.
So you've mentioned that we need to strive towards aging well. What is that in your view?
I'm sorry, there's a noise. Can you say it again, Martha?
You mentioned a couple of times that we should be striving to age well. Can you get more specific? What does that mean?
So I will be specific in a sort of modeling sense. In the book, I try and sort of tackle some of these issues. We obviously don't want to be prescriptive. I think at every age you should be wanting to try and do the things that it is you want to do, and you should be able to do it. And that will require resources and social opportunities to do it. But if I really drill down to aging well in particular, my three-dimensional longevity dividend, and I'm speaking as an economist, it's maintaining your health for as long as possible. I mean, health is incredibly important to us. And now in high-income countries, the main threat to our health is aging-related diseases. So making sure you maintain your health for a very long time or as long as possible to compress morbidity is just incredibly important. The second thing, of course, is if you will be living for longer, you've got to be able to produce more resources over your lifetime, or else you see a fall in your standard of living. Now, maybe AI will come along and give us all those extra resources, but ignoring those sort of productivity leaps, if we were living longer, we have to be productive for longer. And I don't necessarily mean working. You can be productive in the household and do your own things, but we've got to make sure that we can earn and support a longer life. So that's about making sure you have the skills, making sure you have the opportunities, and you can carry on working for longer. So in terms of governments, they're the two key things that I would focus on: health and working for longer. And when I say working for longer, we can talk about retirement and working, increasing the state pension age. But for me, there's a really big problem, which is at 50 in America, 80% of people are working. By 65, that's come down to about a third. And that drop in employment, I think, is a really key policy priority for governments, and one they're kind of a little bit oblivious to, but we need to start getting them to say, look, you keep raising the state pension age, but if you're not working at the state pension age, no point in doing that. Right. Raising the state pension age may solve a financial problem for the government. It doesn't solve the underlying problem we have. Can I keep working for longer? Do I have the health? Do I have the skills? Does my job let me do it? And if we don't tackle that, then we're just not going to achieve this three-dimensional longevity dividend.
So let's stick with this for a minute. You mentioned in your book, you talked about the NHS crisis, and that the underlying infrastructure isn't keeping up with longer lives. Aging longer is going to cost more. And I think you put it, is aging well a nice to have versus a critical priority?
Yeah. And that's, where I use the health tools, and I wrote the paper in Nature Aging, where we sort of come up with trillion-dollar values. I mean, let me put it another way around. If you think about what happened during COVID, governments took steps to shutter the economy that produced like a 3% fall of GDP. And they did that in order to save lives. To improve life expectancy by a year or whatever. That was the impact COVID would have had. And I think that's a great way of looking at it, because you go, wow, life expectancy, health is really important. We're prepared to lose that much GDP to keep us alive for longer and keep us healthy for longer. And that's how I think we should look at this healthy aging issue. How valuable is it for us to age well using those sorts of trade-offs? And it's enormously important. In my family at the moment, there's someone with dementia, and it's a it's a cruel disease. It's a real problem, and we're going to have to spend a lot of money to care for that person. But my goodness, I'd spend much more if we could avoid them having dementia. So this is what I mean by the welfare gains from health, and the biggest health. There's lots of health challenges to deal with, but actually aging well is now our biggest health challenge. It's worth billions. It's not a nice to have. And go back to AI, climate change, and what's going to determine our future. It's remarkable we don't talk more about how can we age better, because it's pretty obvious that for all of us, this is going to be a defining influence on our future.
I have to say that as I was reading the book, I was struggling to keep up with all of your literary and cultural references.
Yeah, some people I'm sympathetic, but yeah. Yeah, it was either that or keep bringing in mathematical functions. We thought literary references would be nice.
Yeah, the Strulberg version of Longer Life versus the Dorian Gray version.
Yeah, but I mean, we know what we're trying to get to there, because if you talk to people about would you like to live a longer life, you get all sorts of different answers. And of course, the key thing is I want to be healthy for longer. Yeah. And the Strulberg model, so it refers to Gulliver's Travels and Jonathan Swift. Jonathan Swift, like he's traveling around the world, going to all sorts of interesting places, and he goes to the island of Lugnag. And in the island of Lugnag, there's the Strulbergs who live forever. He says, this is great. Then he meets them. And they may live forever, but they age normally. So they are terrified about getting old. And it's a vicious portrayal of old age. And Swift clearly was fearful of growing old. We think he died of dementia, and as he got older and older, he got more and more unhappy. But it is a horrible picture of where we have, as Eileen Crimmins from USC says, slowed down the dying process, but not the aging process. And I think that's a little bit what's happening at the moment. We have achieved an increase in life expectancy, but health span is not increasing at the same rate. So it is overwhelmingly important to raise health span to catch up with lifespan.
So let's talk about how the health system needs to be re-engineered for healthier life, not just longer life. And maybe instead of Swift, we can think about sort of the fountain of youth, in which people stayed in youth for hundreds of years.
Yeah. We call that Dorian Gray in the book, but I call it Dorian Gray. So there's a bunch of things, and of course, I'm sure it won't be a surprise to any of you if I say it's about prevention is going to be key. One of the great ironies of life to me is the World Health Organization is responsible for the international classification of diseases. Our health system is based around disease, not on health. And in the book, I quote W.H. Jordan, the British poet, who says, health is a subject that medicine knows nothing about. It's a nice controversial quote. I said it to a cardiologist the other day who said, no, health is just an incomplete diagnosis. Something will happen and then we'll be able to do something about it. But it is remarkable, and health is more than just the absence of disease. But right now, our system is based around the notion that if you get a disease, when it's sufficiently manifests itself that it's causing you a problem and a discomfort, go along and we'll see what we can do about it. And for aging-related diseases, by which I mean the diseases where your probability of getting them are increasing the longer you live, that's a terrible way of dealing with them, because we tend not to be able to cure these aging-related diseases, at least for now. And the other problem with these aging-related diseases is once you get one of them, the time to get the next one speeds up. And then when you've got two, the time to speed up gets the next one. So if you look at the UK, these are called morbidities, these health problems. There's quite a lot of older people who've got no morbidities. There's an awful lot who've got 4. But once you get 1, you then get 2, then you get 3, and then you get 4. So there's sort of fewer people in the middle than you'd expect. So you've really got to stop getting these. So that's about this focus on prevention. And in the US, the stats say $12,500 a year per person are spent on health, $350 on prevention. And that's probably more than is spent in the UK, which spends a lot less on both scores. So prevention, we've had massive innovation in intervention. Wonderful achievements, which is why we're living longer. I think we need to focus on innovation in public health and also in prevention. And with big data and screening, I think there's a lot of scope to try and do that. And I think the UK is an interesting area there. Our health system is on its knees. It can't cope with this intervention and a growing number of older people. We can't put more and more resources into it because we can't afford it. But the Treasury, the Minister of Finance, is a single buyer of healthcare in the UK. So it can recognize that if it can do prevention, it can save money on intervention. And we've got an integrated health system with big data records. So I think possibly, given the mess we're in, this is an interesting opportunity for the UK to invest in preventative health.
So I've always been told that health takes place outside the doctor's office. I think sort of some of what you're saying. And a doctor actually said that to me, or quoted that to me. So it stuck with me. There's a lot to do with individual behaviors and maybe even group behaviors. How does a health system incentivize better behaviors, or educate, or help us make better choices?
So before I answer that, let me give you sort of a broad answer that comes across time and time again when I talk about. So what my book tries to say is that we're actually at a really profound moment in human history. And by the way, I'm normally really against any business school professor who comes along and says we live in a time of unparalleled change and all that. It's normally nonsense. But when for the first time ever that we can expect to become old and we have to change how we age, my goodness, that demands a big cultural reset, a big institutional reset. It's a radically different moment for humanity. And, the book says all these things need to change. And it can be a bit overwhelming just how much, governments need to change. We need to change. Social norms need to change. The social security system, the health system. And it's like, oh, it's impossible. But of course, it won't change. Some things will change quickly. Most things take a long while. In the 20th century, we redesigned life. We created teenagers. We created a pension and retirement. We created a midlife crisis. We created our career structure, education systems. We created the weekend. All of these things took a while, but we adapted. And I think when it comes to longevity, I think we do have to be what I would call a patient optimist. It's going to take a while to happen. But I think you've put your finger on a really key thing. Below 80, the estimates are that about 80% of how we age is behavior and environment, and 20% is genetic. And that's a stunning number. 80% is our behavior and our environment. And so much of that is then outside of the health system. Our traditional health system treats disease, therefore health is determined largely outside of the existing health system. It's going to be the air that we breathe. It's going to be how we get from A to B. It's going to be the food that we buy, and our interactions in the community. All the things that the Stanford Center focuses on so well. So wow, that's a big shift. That requires social norms. It requires new ways of doing things. I don't want to be totally pessimistic about that, because we also know, by the way, that some of that behavior and environment, it's fine for people with higher income to say, I can choose my behavior, I can choose my environment. Inequality shows how malleable age is. And again, I think there's a big role to play for governments to do something around that. But I think there's lots of things that can be done that don't just require major social change. Let me give an example. During COVID, we learned how to do vaccinations outside the traditional health system. And I think that's a great model for tackling preventative health, lots and lots of diseases that, like cholesterol, for instance. Cholesterol is linked into cardiovascular activity, heart attacks, diabetes, dementia. If we could roll out ways of tackling those in the community outside the traditional health system, I think we're going to have really great outcomes longer term. And then, public health also has a role to play here. In general, people are smoking less and drinking less. So I think there's scope for longer term education changes as well. I'm trying to be optimistic here.
So you said you're a patient optimist. What other things are making you optimistic about our ability to sort of make this kind of radical change that we need to make?
Yeah, I am a patient optimist, although the world is sorely testing me at that at the moment. I'm clinging on by my fingernails to being a patient optimist. But when it comes to aging and longevity, I also think it's important for us as a group to say, absolutely, there is ageism. Absolutely, there are problems and challenges, but also to recognize that change has happened. One of the statistics that I think is extraordinary, and I often ask this of ministers of finance, central bank people, I ask them, how much of employment growth in your country over the last 10 years has come from workers aged over 50? And none of them know. And they go, oh, that's a good question. They say, well, 10, 15%. It's extraordinary. The reality is in the US, it's about 60%. In my country, it's 75%. In Europe, it's 100%. The majority of employment growth is now being driven by workers aged over 50. And for all of the talk of ageism, which clearly exists, it's clearly there, the labour market has absorbed huge numbers of older workers. So workers become more age friendly, not for everyone, but for some. Older workers are broader, more educated and healthier than previous generations. So I think some progress has been happened. It's less than we'd like, but I do think it's a little bit like water dripping on a stone. Bit by bit, we see changes happening. And I suspect we should move on very swiftly. But even the debate around the age of the two presidential candidates, I think, is part of that process of normalizing what this process of change.
So let me ask you about that, Andrew. So at the beginning, you talked about you actually danced around it a little bit, which you said, people have to get used to working longer. But then you said working, it doesn't have to be work as we normally define. Doesn't it have to be work? Aren't we talking about processes which we're going to just normalize? And the only way to really pay for greater longevity is if people work longer. And the issue should be like, how do we make longer careers more palatable to people, as opposed to saying, well, you'll do other things that are productive.
Yeah. No, so, like many issues in this topic, it's multidimensional. So at a first level, 100%, let me go back. If we're living for longer and we don't want to see a fall in our standard of living every year, we have to be more productive. Full stop. And there's just no way out of that problem. Because if we're not each more productive, the only way to pay for a long life is to take it from someone else. And that's a sort of, that's not, that's a self-defeating game. So it could be we get, I say, revolutionary productivity gains, problem solved. But of course, being more productive over your life doesn't necessarily mean you have to work beyond the pension age. And I think there is some, in economic terms, money left on the table at the moment, given the number of people who leave work between 50 and 65. So in the United States, we go from 80% of people working at 50 to about a third at 65. If you could half that rate of decline, so it went from 80 to 55%, this is all below the Social Security age, that's an extra 4% of GDP if you do a back of the envelope calculation every single year. So, wow, that would go a long way to pay for things. And yes, sure, you may also need to work beyond that. And many people do, either because they want to or they have to. But that's what I mean by being more productive over your lifetime, because if we have large numbers of people leave the labour market after 50, it's a problem. Going back to it is paid work. As an economist, I use the word productive in a very broad sense. It's creating resources. And those resources can be for me or for other members of the family. We know that older people are very active and caring in all sorts of community ways. And that creates resources for society as a whole. So it doesn't have to be paid work. And as an economist, when I use the word productive, everyone tends to jump on me and say, oh, it's not just about work. But yeah, money is also important. So we do have to be more productive in a financial sense. But as I say, at the moment, I think governments focus too much on just raising the Social Security age because it solves their financial problem. It doesn't solve actually how we're more productive.
Yeah, there's a cultural change that has to come.
Yeah, and also, I talk about health, but this notion of age-friendly jobs that I've done work on with Darren Asimov at MIT and Nikolai Morbach. Jobs have become much more age-friendly in the sense they're more flexible, they give people more autonomy, they're less physically demanding. But not all jobs have become more age-friendly. Construction, for instance, is very age-unfriendly and has not become more age-friendly. So we also, I think, need labour market policies that help people make those transitions. Because it's very hard to carry on doing manual labor if you for a long time. So we need to help people transit into other jobs that are age friendly, give a sense of purpose, give a sense of meaning and engagement, but also provide money.
There's a question from the audience actually that you started actually talking about it, asking whether the growth that you just described among older workers, the older workers' contribution to productivity gains, is that driven by older workers wanting to work or needing to work?
So the increase in employment of older workers comes about from two channels, it's hard to totally answer that question. So I'll get there in small chunks with decreasing confidence. The first thing is just a lot more older people. So, the baby boomers are a big generation. Older people have always worked. There's now loads of older workers, so they're a big part of employment growth. So about 2/3 of the increase of older workers' employment has come about because there's more of them. And then about 1/3 has happened because they're more likely to work. So in other words, the labor force participation rate of older workers has increased. If you drill down into that a little bit, you find that male college graduates haven't changed their likelihood of working much. It's the other categories that have increased. So is that because they want to work or they need to work? I think the further out you go in age, I mean, it's a hard one because I'm not sure lots of 50-year-olds want to work. They just feel they need to work. So as an economist, those are sort of slightly complicated. People may choose to work, but I'd rather not, but I want to get the money. I think if you go beyond 65, particularly in America, where you have very high labor force participation rates above 65, it's very bifurcated, very split. There's a whole bunch of people who are working because they want to work, they enjoy it, and they can. University professors will be slap bang in that bunch. And then there's a whole bunch of people who just have to keep working because they haven't got the financial security or they haven't got the health insurance and they have to keep working. So I would say that further out you go, the more you see that split, particularly in the United States.
I want to touch on, as we're talking about work, you sort of weave in the book things that we think are quite important. That is developing a sense of meaning and purpose and continued engagement. And certainly work provides that for many people. But can you sort of expand on your thinking about how do we find purpose and refine purpose as we're living, a longer life?
And in fact, that's actually a good segue to let me go back to the previous question. So again, let me look at it just from an economic lens. An economic lens is very incomplete, but also has some insights. So from an economic point of view, you want to carry on working if the benefit of working for another year exceeds the cost in a very simple-minded way. So the benefit might be the money. It could be a sense of purpose, a sense of engagement. I enjoy my work. And the costs are, the loss of leisure. Perhaps you'll not be able to spend time with your family. It could be that you're physically taxed and exhausted by work. So if you want to help people be productive for longer, you've got to work on both those margins. How do I make the work more meaningful? And how do I reduce the cost of work? That may be flexible working. It may be making jobs more age friendly, but I think it's trying to affect that margin. So if people are having to work for longer, they find it easier to work for longer. So this creation of age-friendly jobs, flexible working, really, really important. And I think that then also fits in with what you're talking about, Martha, because, if I get meaning and purpose in a job, then it's going to be easier for me to carry on working in it. But I think it's not just about a job, is it? And for me, I sort of, I can't remember if I said in the book, but an economist, I sort of think of these things in sort of financial terms or investment terms. And, when talking about health, we think about biology, and talking about the economy, you think about GDP. It can easily become quite technocratic. But of course, at the heart of all this is a very human thing, which is we're living for longer. What do we do with that time? And in working on the book, I read Simone de Beauvoir's book from the 70s, An Old Age. I really enjoyed it. She's angry. She's really angry. And she sort of says, what's the point? You hear people say, oh, save more, choose somewhere nice to live, get a hobby. But kind of, what's the point? We've got to change the system. We just underestimate the capacity of older people. And I remember hearing Laura and others at Stanford talk about it's more time to develop as an adult. I didn't totally get that, I confess at first. I sort of intellectually got it, but didn't sort of get it in a visceral, emotional sense. But that's really the point of a longer life, I think, is to, I quote the Greek poet Pindar, the point of life is to be who you were always meant to be, having discovered what that is. And I think, this is this sense of growth. And we tend to medicalize old age. We see old age as decline. But as Laura's work says, that's just not true. Lots of things also increase with age. And for me, I think that's that adult development story. And when life was short, I talked about my brother dying in the first few days. When life was short, we rushed adult development. And, I will say my father was never a teenager. He was born in 1925. At 14, he went to work. And I think the New Yorker first mentions the word teenager in something like 1937. So
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure my dad at 12 was not reading the New Yorker. So we rushed adult development, and then look at my kids; they're taking longer over adult development. But of course, this long life, we can do transitions and change later. And I think that's really what we want to try and do. And for everyone of any income status, what we really want is to provide them the opportunities to do what they wish to do, to become the person they want. And that, of course, involves all sorts of tackles against ageism, but also creating those social institutions that enable people to do it right the way through life. And, the 20th century did, I think, take some backward steps in terms of age segregation, creating the sense that older people, everyone over 65 is old and is unproductive, and created a model of retirement which was popular and useful, but is clearly just not fit for purpose in the 21st century.
I love a comment just popped up in the chat. My first 40 years of work was just research for the next 20.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that forward. And by the way, I think this is the interesting issue. So we're obsessed with chronological age, which is very backward looking. And far more interesting to me is how many more years I've got to live. And that's why at 58, I think I'm different from my father at 58 and my grandfather, because I've got to think differently. And that forward-looking aspect, I think, is great. So that 40-20 is a nice example of that.
It's one thing that strikes me, Andrew, about what you're saying is the lack of infrastructure for people who want to have a second act or who want to imagine sort of retirement as a career. I was at a wedding in between various travels, and I was struck between the wedding couple and all their plans. Everyone was toasting them and all their plans, work, kids, career, buying houses, all the things, all the benchmarks away. And I was at table 23, the last table, which was the old folks, the friends of the bride's parents. And our topic was retirement, and it was filled with sort of nothing.
Yeah.
And that's what we were celebrating, sort of in that table, the nothingness of retirement. And it couldn't have been a starker difference. And how do you change the norms around those years to help people reimagine what the life would be?
Yeah, and it is, and when you think about it, it's an extraordinary word, retirement, isn't it? It's literally that sense of withdrawing, which is, literally that's what it sort of refers to. So, yeah, this is about how we make social change happen and how we do social innovation. And we know that sort of examples are key. I think, when you're doing social innovation, you look around and say, oh, that looks good. I quite fancy doing that. And let me again come back to this issue of retirement, because I completely agree. It's a stage that needs to be reinvented, but it has undergone a pretty profound change. I'm the word retirement now is a weasel word that weeds many, many things. It's no longer the idea that at a certain age, everyone comes to the hard stop of work. And so we've already got quite a big change has happened. Some people unretire. Many people work part-time after retirement. So I think we're seeing change start to happen. Some of that change, I think, it's still under institutionalized, and that there's much that is needed to do. But I think we can see this process happening. But how do we create the narrative? I do think that the focus on chronological age is hugely misleading, and the age segregation that brings is hugely misleading. But it's going to take a while, isn't it, to sort of change those social norms? But it is. I think it's that focus on time for me that is key, and telling people, well, you've got time. What do you want to do with that time? And so much of the discussion around an aging society is not about time. It's about, underestimating the capacity of older people, focusing inevitably upon frailty, that you can't do things, rather than what are the possibilities you could do with that time. And that's why, again, I'm so keen to phrase this as longevity, which is about time, and then saying, well, I've got that extra time, but it's only good if I'm healthy and I've got options. How do I make that happen?
I have two observations. I turned 65 later this summer, and I'm totally surprised at how many people are asking me, "Are you retiring?"
Yeah,
And I'm laughing. I'm like, these are friends who know the work I do. I'm going, I don't know what I would do with that.
I know.
And then
Which,
I talked to my 21-year-old, um, about retiring, and Skylar's like, I don't know what that means.
yeah, which I
So,
think is right. I mean, I think you're going to see, um, so I think we see a lot more heterogeneity around retirement, a lot more difference in what people do. And I think that's a great thing because I think some people will want to carry on working, others won't be able to. Um, but I think if people want to work and can work, brilliant. If they can't and don't want to, that's fine. But we'll see that play out in a very, very diverse way. But I think a really big change that we'll see in the 20th century, we fixed retirement at sort of 65, and then we saw this big increase in life expectancy. So we took a lot of leisure after retirement. I think what we'll see in the 21st century, we'll see the retirement age increase because of social security pressures, but we'll take a lot more leisure this side of retirement. So it may be that your last job is part-time. It may be that you do some career breaks and some transitions, but I think that'll be a really big shift. So we may work for longer, but we'll take more leisure this side. And again, I think that's probably quite healthy. If I were designing my life, I'm not sure I'd want 30 years of retirement at the end. I kind of got some of those years before then.
mhm, mhm.
There's actually a sort of dialogue going on in the chat about the idea, actually pushing back against some of the things I said. Someone noted that that she didn't have a job that she
Yeah,
wanted to continue after six, didn't actually have an age, after a certain number of years.
yeah,
And I guess I mean, unrelated to that comment, I was thinking as you were talking, the lower you are on the economic spectrum, the less flexibility you have to redesign your life. It's more
yeah.
about survival. So, how do we think about people who are in jobs that are um, uh, scratching by and
Yeah.
perhaps unappealing? And how do we get them to a place where they can have the benefits of longer life as well?
So you're always going to have some form of redistribution. So let me sort of come back to a number of issues here. First is I think it's very important we condition not the retirement age, because retirement is illegal in most countries, but the social security, the age at which you can claim social security
Yeah.
benefit,
Yeah.
should be indexed to some function of population healthy life expectancy. It doesn't have to be the average, it could be the lower quartile. You can allow for inequality here, because if we are not keeping people healthy for longer, it is not right to make them work for longer. And if we did do that, we'd have ministries of finance with a greater incentive to make sure people aged healthily well. So I think that would be a really big step forward to making a much fairer intellectual bargain with the population, and would force us to tackle inequality. I also, go back to that decline in labor participation from 50 to 65. Those are people who fall ill, who skills are out of date, suffer from ageism, or are doing physical jobs they can't carry on. So there's a big skew towards the lower income group. And I think trying to find a way to maintain that employment for longer so that they're healthier for longer, they're doing jobs that are less unpleasant, absolutely key. Absolutely key. So I think this is all speaking to the same point. But then we do come back to a bigger challenge, which is if we are living for longer, and although the life expectancy gains are unequally distributed, people are living longer than their parents and their grandparents at the moment. You do have to be productive for longer. And it could be we can deal with that through social security transfers from the wealthy to the less wealthy. But we then have to think about how do we create jobs that are less unpleasant for people as we get older, and how do we manage those transitions? I gave the example of a construction worker earlier. There's lots of skills that a construction worker's got that can be useful in a range of settings, which I hope would be less unpleasant. And now I think that's a role for individuals, communities, but also governments. In Europe, when we had high unemployment, we had all sorts of schemes to help people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s shift from one occupation to another. Those were active labour market policies. But as always with older workers, we tend not to think about applying those policies to older workers. We have to.
I think we've got time for just one more bit of discussion that I didn't want to end this conversation without talking about. How do we, how do we ensure intergenerational fairness? We at the center, like you, we think about longevity as lifespan. We spend as much time talking about the need to invest in young children as we do helping people age well. A lot of the things we're talking about sort of allocate funds towards people as they get older.
Yeah.
How do we make sure that we don't lose sight of what needs to happen early in life and the funds to support them?
No, I think this is a really interesting issue, and a couple of things. One reason why I'm keen on longevity rather than aging, because it does, I think, emphasize that the young are key. The young have faced the longest lives of all, and if our current institutions don't support the life expectancy I've got, they really don't work for the young. But if we focus on an aging society, we're forever propping up a system at the end, which is too late. We need to make the current young the healthiest ever future old. So that's really, really important. And aging well is about various life cycle interventions. So there's a lot there. But there's in a world where the young will now become old, we have to, for the first time, understand that life course approach. When the young tended not to become old, it is less useful. But I think there is an issue here, which is, let me take the labour market as an example. I don't think older people working for longer creates unemployment. As an economist, I can tell you that's not the case. But it does change the labour market. It does mean there's more people competing for the same jobs. That pushes wages down and it stops career opportunities. So we've got to find a way to redesign work so that it's not so hierarchical. Mm-hmm. So that if people stay in their job for longer and longer and longer, they're just accumulating more and more power and control. And that's a really big shift. We've got to try and find a way that is inclusive for everyone. And I think we may have to rework some of our institutions. So, I talked earlier about the US presidential election. In the US, political leaders tend to be getting older. In Europe, they're getting younger. I don't think it's necessarily a problem they're getting older in the US. I think if you look at Congress and the Senate, the distribution by age is not too different from the distribution in the entire population. So that in some sense is representative. But are there features of, say, the US system that will perpetuate having more and more older leaders so that it's less inclusive? So, finding those changes and twists to ensure that we are intergenerationally fair is, I think, a key part of this longevity experience. That could be digital voting, because younger people are more likely to vote if you do it digitally. It could be term limits in congressional office and things of that form. But we do need to ensure that everyone is represented and everyone is included. And, for most of human history, we didn't live as long as we do now. People would have lots of children over a large time span, and households were naturally intergenerational. We now have fewer children, we live for longer. Society is now less naturally intergenerational. But that's something we've got to correct with this longer life and falling fertility rates.
Andrew, thank you. As always, when we're with you, I sort of learned so much, and this has been absolutely terrific. And before we sign off, I want to mention to our audience, we have the next two virtual book clubs scheduled. On June 6th, we will be hosting a conversation with Maddie Dykewald, the author of Ageless Aging, A Woman's Guide to Increasing Health Span, Brain Span, and Lifespan. And then on August 7th, we will be in conversation with Venki Ramakrishnan, the author of Why We Die, The New Science of Aging and the Quest for Immortality. And by then, my traveling colleague will be back stateside. So we'll look forward to being on the same continent. And Andrew, we look forward to the next time we see you in a couple of months.
Look forward to it very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martha.